In this video, I cover some typical, very common watercolor mistakes and how to get around them. Not necessarily how to avoid them, but you've made a mistake, how do you get around it? So you don't give up on the painting, don't throw it away, continue on with the painting. How can we solve those mistakes? And you will see me make a couple of little sort of errors, and I try my best to get around those. Well, it'd be interesting to see what you think. Subject of this watercolor tutorial, and this will be a complete step-by-step demo. I will go through the complete process with you of the composition, the initial drawing, then different painting stages, laying down the wash. We'll cover different watercolor techniques, laying down the wash, getting in areas of contrast, different brush marks, bit of wet in wet, and then how to paint these reflections, these lovely reflections as well, how to paint and draw boats. As I say, complete step-by-step demo and a lovely harbour scene. So hello, my name is Tim Wilmot. I'm a watercolour painter and I am a watercolour tutor as well. Thanks for watching this video. I do hope you get a lot from it, and I would love to hear of your common mistakes that you come across or that you have difficulties with in watercolour and how you would get around them. Love to hear from you, because I really do want to try and focus on that in this video. So stick around, stick through the whole process. I'm going to be going through in real time the complete process of a watercolour painting with this lovely harbour scene, Chania or Chania in Crete, Greece. Stick around, and first step will be the drawing. First step then, do the drawing, and I'm using a 3B pencil as per normal and just getting in the main lines. I'm starting with the wall just behind the quayside, the top edge of the wall, and then there's a couple of blinds on the right hand side there. They'll be fairly light against the background, and then the quayside itself, the boats I'll just draw in fairly roughly. They're in the distance, so I don't need to be too precise with the drawing, but I do want to, with this row of boats, I do want to make sure they're all in a line, and also they're not too regularly spaced, they're not too identical with each other, so a little bit of a variation in the boats and their heights and sizes and so on. So that one, for example, has got a little bit of a covering, a little sort of blind over the top of the boat. Then maybe a smaller one to the side of that. Then next to this one, slightly taller one with a cabin. And then another one on the right hand side. An outline for the buildings in the background, a few trees. The main block in the middle at the back. And then there's a narrower one on the right hand side with some balconies coming out to the right hand side, silhouetted against the brighter sky. That's just coming down into the water. That's just a rough indication of where I want the edge of the reflections for that narrow building. And then in the middle there's a fairly simple white boat pointing towards us. So I need to get the perspective right on that, with the sides of the boat a little bit narrow at the back. And then one next to it, motor at the end, just a slightly different angle. That's the near side, this is the far side. When I draw these boats, I don't often have very straight edges, so I like a little bit of a quirkiness to them. Some fenders for the boats. Yeah, so I think boats, they don't look too real if you make the edges very straight. They need a few little bumps and objects along the top ridge of the boat, along the gunnels of the boat, just where bits of where the oars might go, for example, or rigging and other bits and pieces. So not too perfect to straight edge. Now the water's edge and the side of the harbour wall, something like that, going along there and in between the boats. Strengthen the sides of that white boat. There's some sort of seat or a larger object on the right hand side, the motor behind it. Sneak in another boat on the right hand side just to balance it up. I just think it needs something there on the right. As I say, it's just really getting in the main objects. This near boat here, this middle boat might be a little bit too long, so I've just raised the bow a bit just to make it a tiny bit shorter. Right, so that's the drawing stage done, and I can't really go on to the painting stage until the drawing looks all right and I've got as good a composition as I can manage. First brush I'm going to be using is a mop brush, a Raphael soft aqua brush. I generally start with the sky coming down, and it's a very, very small part of the overall painting, so it will be dealt with very quickly, maybe a little bit darker on the left and the right, the sort of strong sunlight coming towards us. There's a slight slope on the board, maybe in about 10 degrees or so, not too steep. And then just inject a little bit of cobalt blue. Let me tell you the colours I'm using in my palette. So at the top I've got neutral tint, then burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, which I'm using a lot of here, and then viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, Windsor red. So I'm using there, Windsor red, just below that, a light red for those blinds. They won't be painted again. Now it is going to dry, this paint's going to dry lighter, so you've got to try and compensate for that. Rest of the colours, cadmium orange, and then down the bottom a lemon yellow, and running across the bottom on the right hand side I've got a lavender, and then next to that there's another cerulean blue but a different hue. What I'm painting now is the wall, the retaining wall behind the jetty, and it's sort of like a sort of mid greyish blue colour. I'm detecting quite a bit of blue, so I'm going with that a predominantly blue colour, cobalt blue. And it's important to have a good edge on your brush, so I can do a little bit of careful painting around, a bit of negative painting around these shapes of the tops of the boats. I don't need to be too precise because they're in the background, and any little imperfections in what I do or little bits I leave out could be different objects on top of the boat. So I'm not too concerned with truly following that edge. The actual harbour wall itself just a little bit darker there. Now what I'm painting now are the blue reflections, the dark reflections of the boat. So this colour is going to be a bit darker than the colour of the boats, which at the moment are white, but I will paint over those a little bit just to dull them down a bit. So this has to be a shade or two darker than the colour of the boats. And I will be letting this dry and going over the top with a darker colour. More on that later on. Right, let me just come down the rest of the paper to the foreground, where I'll go fairly light and still a bit of careful painting around these foreground boats because they're going to be catching the light. Down the left-hand side of the paper, around that fender. It's quite a nice soft brush, this one. And in fact, there's so many different makes and models of mop brushes. As long as it's soft and it's got good water retaining capability, then you can paint these large areas without having to continually go back and mix more colour. You can keep the flow, keep the momentum going. Now I have inadvertently left a little bit of white space to the left of that white boat. More on that later on. I'm not noticing it at the time of painting. So this commentary is coming after the painting, where I can spot these things and point them out to you. But as the water is drying, as the sea is drying, I'm just going in with a bit more detail on the inside of this boat here. I'm constantly looking at the reference photo, trying to pick up the main blocks, the main areas of darker colour, this sort of brown colour. Over to the middle, and there's these sort of seats going across, 2 or 3 seats going across, and the darker recess between them. Just using my time while the sea is drying a bit, because what I want to do is going with a few softer waves, softer ripples in the foreground, but I can't do that until the sea has dried a bit. Now I'm mixing some thicker colour here, cerulean blue, that lavender, bit of burnt sienna to darken it down a bit, mixing it well so it doesn't sort of split when I put brush to paper. And this is thicker. The sea has dried a little bit, but it's still, if I look against the light, it's still got a tiny bit of a shine on it. It hasn't dried. It's it's sort of between that moist and damp stage, if I could describe it like that. So it's been given a minute or two to dry. And then I can go in with these darker values, darker, thicker paint, less water, and I should get some soft waves and it won't spread out too much. Now in the bottom right corner there's a few little, I want to try and get in a bit of a circular pattern around this white boat in the middle, as if it's just been rocked from side to side and it's just created a few little disturbances in the water. So I do a tiny test on the side, and if it looks all right, then continue on. Just a few, not overdo it. Again, I'm looking at the reference photo and just trying to pick up the main areas there in that bottom right corner where there was that disturbance. Now I'm drying. I've muted the hairdryer. I'm drying things up to speed up my painting process. I find with a painting I have to do it all in one. I'm with my painting I can't start a painting and then stop it and then wait a few hours or a day and then come back to it. I feel it's just me. I feel I've just got to do it all in one. So the hairdryer is an essential piece of equipment for me. If you do want to get more involved in some of the painting activities I do, then please take a look at my Patreon site, www.patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. Up there you'll see different levels of membership, or tiers as Patreon calls it, different levels of participation, and it's a very active club. Think of it like a club, an online watercolor club, where we've got members from all over the world, and I'm setting different projects on a monthly basis, and depending on what level you're at, you'll get then a text or video critique back from me with some extra hints and tips on how you might improve things. So take a look at that, patreon.com/Tim Wilmot, if you want to get involved and get active during this period on different painting projects. We've also got an image sharing service as well. Take a look at that. More on that later on. Now these trees. This video is all about mistakes and how to get around them when you've spotted a mistake. This colour, these are the trees, these umbrella pines that I'm painting in here. These lovely evocative pine trees that you see all over the Mediterranean look like an umbrella with a sort of like mushroom top to them. Beautiful trees. At least I think they're these sort of pine trees. Pan parasol, they call them in France, in French. Pan parasol. And I've put in that light green for the top edge, and I'm drying it now. Now there could have been two ways of doing this. I could have, when I did the first wash, I could have gone in with a bit of light green there where the trees were. I would have got a soft edge against the sky, but if I'd have made the paint thicker, the paint wouldn't have travelled too much into the sky, so I might have got away with a slightly harder edge. But the danger is I put that in too dark, I reckon, and I want the background buildings to be a little bit lighter. And the other issue I've got is that not cleaning the brush out too much, it's a little bit contaminated with that green. So me now painting in the background buildings, which are a sort of, I would describe them as sort of a yellow ochre, a sort of pinkish yellow ochre, I reckon, is the colour, the true colour. But they're in the distance. I don't want to make them too red. Yeah, so it's a little bit contaminated with that green, do you see? Which I will try and compensate for as I go through. So that's the first thing I'd like to share with you. I'm not sure what your technique would be. Let me know in the comments down below. What would your technique be for painting in this row of trees? The light is coming towards you. You've got darker buildings behind them, but you've got some little light tops to some of the trees. What's your technique? And you can see here now I'm going down with this lighter color, or it's a similar value really to the trees, but we've got that nasty edge where the color of the buildings is going over the trees. I've got that nasty sort of dark line now, whereas I wanted the light. I wanted the tops to be light, so I'm going to have to think of a way of getting around that. You'll see that very shortly. Anyway, continue with the right hand side. Things are progressing okay over there. Slightly darker balconies against the brighter sky. That looks sort of okay. I'm just really painting that in sort of quite loosely. So I'll continue on down with the buildings below the trees, or sort of as you're looking through the canopy of the trees, there's little bits of lighter building showing through. Change colour to more of a bluish colour for some of the shop blinds and the ground floor details. So this is how I'm getting around that nasty border along the top edge of the tree, where I painted in the tree and then let it dry, and then I went over the top of it with the building colour, and I had that line. So I'm sort of going over it again with a soft brush. A little bit further, I'm extending the border of the tree just a little bit further, and I've covered up that line. Hopefully it will still look fairly fresh. You can get away with it with good quality watercolor paper. If this was cheaper paper, it may not be so forgiving, and I would end up with a messy, maybe muddy watercolor. It might look overworked as well, but I think I'm trying to get away with it, and adding on thicker paint here for the trees, going darker now to the bottom of the trees, adding in a bit of neutral tint there. Do you see? Sorry for the glare. As it dries, it will become clearer. The whole area though is in the background, so I don't need to be too precise with the details. So maybe I'm being a little bit too hard on myself, but it is in the background, so I can be fairly simple with that. Now mix up a bit more of a green to cover up the left-hand side. There's a bit of shrubby and smaller plants on the left-hand side. There's a sort of bank that slopes down from left to right, down to the retaining wall behind the harbour. So that's where I'm going to go a little bit darker to form the top edge of that retaining wall. bit of a lighter green. I'm mixing up different intensities of greens, different combinations of blues and yellows. So I'm getting subtle variations in that, as you would see in the source photo, and I can see blues in there as well, some cool blues. So we're getting the feeling of different vegetation on that bank. Planning is very good in a watercolor painting, trying to think before you commit what your steps might be, the sequence of steps might be in your painting. I know a lot of people do a thumbnail sketch. I do that sometimes just to get it right in my mind, what sequence I'm going to go through. I'll draw on a bit of scrap paper the basic composition, and maybe I might number them. So almost painting by numbers, painting in a number sequence. In my mind, I'm getting the sequence of the process, and what am I going to paint first? So number 1 would be the sky, number 2 would be the sea, and then number 3 would be the background. Do you see? Now, another way in which I've got around that watercolor mistake of the trees is to use a little bit of splattering, which is really good, I think, on foliage on trees to give a sort of interesting texture to foliage, to particularly middle ground or foreground trees. You get some quite nice effects. Don't overdo it though, with splattering with fairly clear water or a similar colour to the tree. But a little bit of splattering with that water, and then just let it do its own thing. You can see on the building just above the trees, the middle building above the trees, there's a nice bloom appearing there, which I actually quite like, these blooms, these cauliflowers appearing, and also on the building on the left. That's quite a nice one as well. I quite like those because that could be something else. You can make them into another tree. It could be giving the effect of an older building, for example, or some of the fascia of the building coming away, peeling off. So you can get in different effects in there. So just let that dry. The brush I'm using for this stage is a medium-sized mop brush. This is a natural brush from where's that one from? That one's from Winsor & Newton, I think, this one. Yeah, Winsor & Newton. And let me just check. Winsor, come on, where are you? Yeah, I think it's a Winsor & Newton brush. A pure squirrel, Petit Gris, pure. So I'm now going in with the lighter colour. So this is lighter than the reflections below, do you see? And slightly sort of greyish colour. I felt the reflections of the boat looked quite blue to me in the photograph. And the actual colours of the boats, they're sort of like a warmer colour, slightly warmer colour. Bit of neutral tint to define the very dark. That's actually probably one of the darkest parts of the whole painting, over on the left-hand side. The actual harbour wall itself, where it meets the water, quite dark. It will dry lighter. At the moment it looks quite harsh, but that will dry a good bit lighter. Going back to those trees though, mistake on the trees. Well, sort of a mistake. You'll see another way of me compensating for that and getting around that issue. But I feel it's actually drying quite nicely now. There's a little bit of a glare on it, so you can't see now the end. Right now you can't see the end effect, so be patient, it will come. Now, continuing on the reflections down to the top of the left-hand boat, so these three boats in the foreground, and using this pure squirrel mop brush with a good edge, and then these reflections, these generally horizontal lines, thin horizontal lines, thinner in the distance, becoming a little bit wider, a little bit fatter as we come down towards the foreground. But just a few of these erratic horizontal lines to create the effect of ripples in the water and the darker reflections of the objects behind the boats. I will go in with a darker colour still for reflections of motors and outboard motors and things like that on the backs of the boats. But this is just the initial reflections. This is actually quite an important stage of the painting. This could be won or lost at this stage by the shapes of these waves and getting reflections to look realistic and representing the objects that they are reflecting above as well. So that's why I'm looking at that line on the right hand side, which is the edge of the building, just making sure that I'm going to be following that line as best I can. The colour for the reflections is quite a nice green in the photo, so I'm mixing up a little bit of that cobalt green, but it's not as vibrant as I'd like it, so I'm mixing in a bit of viridian green, almost a 50-50 combination of those two to try and get in quite a nice green. It will, of course, dry lighter, but I think that's quite a nice combination of those two to represent this lovely sea in the harbour. Now paint around that outboard motor of the second boat, and then I'll call this one the middle boat where I'm going around now. Use the fingertips if I've put in too much paint somewhere. I know some people might, if they put too much paint down, you might lift off that paint with a dry brush or a damp brush so it sucks up that moisture. I very rarely would lift off when the paint is dry. I find unless you've got really, really good paper and you've got a lot of practice of lifting off paint when it's dried, generally speaking, I think you end up with a bit of a mess, and it can look a bit overworked. So it's you best attend to these mistakes as soon as you can, really, rather than having to lift off paint. Few little squiggly marks on the right hand side. So as the reflections come towards us, there will be more gaps appearing between the waves, and it will become a little bit more, these wave shapes will be a little bit more erratic. Some more important marks coming up. I want to try and get this circular pattern around that middle boat as if it's just being rocked from side to side. So I'll try and now from the left hand side of the boat create a few of these marks. I'm using the edge of this mop brush, just checking the edge when I've mixed the paint, check the edge again just to make sure I've got that edge. I don't want too much paint on the brush, otherwise I won't get some nice well-defined wave shapes. and if it's too dry, I'll end up with a dry brush mark rather than a solid brush shape, a solid brush mark. So it's a little bit of practice, and with the mop brush it does hold a lot of water, so I can keep painting without having to go back and mix some more colour. And when I've done it, just leave it like the sky. I shouldn't really overdo things. There I use my fingertip again just to lift off a little bit of paint. Now for the boats on the left, well, that boat on the left hand side, these three boats in the foreground, the hull, side of the hull facing towards us, a little bit of cobalt blue there for this second boat. And I'm going to make the actual side of the boat, the colour of the boat, merge with the reflection so that we have them all as one. So that's effectively, that line there is where the bottom of that second boat will be. Now the middle boat, likewise, we're just seeing the bow of the boat, and I'm sort of making it up because it's hidden by the photograph. That white edge just to the left of the middle boat, I don't think it's actually too obvious now. The sea has dried quite a lot, and it's not so obvious, so I'm not too worried about that. And you get these random patterns in sea anyway. So darker reflection now for these foreground boats, bit of neutral tint, and my sea colour, but I'm starting off mainly with neutral tint. I want to be quite dark along the waterline here of this boat, quite dark there, and I'm getting a soft edge because the paint hasn't dried from these boats, the hulls, so it's merging in with each other, getting quite a nice soft edge to that. And the white boat, dark colour, it's actually quite thicker as well than the colour I use for the boats. So it is merging a little bit, but not, it's sort of going up rather than coming down, if you see what I mean. That's the reflection of the fender above. Fenders always make boats. I was talking about the tops, the ridges of the boats not being too perfect and introducing little bumps and objects on them and that sort of thing. Well, fenders and lines along the top of the boat, a water line, these are different elements that will just almost make any sort of object into a boat by putting in those lines. Now I do need to cover up some of these whiter areas. There's a few, I've left a few too many gaps here, which I will cover up later on. There we are, a little bit of covering up there. There we go. Too many. Apart from Patreon, I do regular online watercolor workshops. If you go to crowdcast.io/Tim Wilmot, Crowdcast is crowdcast.io, India Oscar, and you'll see my up-and-coming watercolor workshops where this is nothing to do with Patreon. This is separate to Patreon, and this is open to painters of any level. And there's lots of interesting subjects that we paint every month, and you get a critique for that. So going back to mistakes, watercolor mistakes, and how to rectify them. So I had those background buildings which are almost a similar value to the trees, and you can't really easily see where the buildings are in relation to those trees. So now adding in some horizontal lines of the balconies and so on, different architectural details, but painting around those tree shapes, I'm just steadily now creating the impression of a building behind those trees and where the edges of those trees are. I still need to add in the tree trunks because they're just blobs at the moment, suspended in midair. They look like, one or two of them look like hot air balloons. But I need to connect them with the ground with some tree trunks. Just cover up a few of those too many white bits showing through. Just a bit too many. And I'm using a smaller synthetic round brush here, which has seen better days, this brush. Been with me a long time. I sometimes don't use it for many weeks, and then I suddenly come back to it. And I just get used to how it handles. With brushes, you just get used to how it handles, and you just will know what kind of mark you're going to make when you hit the paper. So there we are. I'm just doing a few more horizontal lines, forming the buildings behind the shop fronts and blinds and so on, but the darker recesses in between. Just giving the impression, not too precise. If I studied those background buildings too much, it would drive me mad trying to get in all the balconies and shapes of the vertical supports and so on. It would just be too difficult. And the danger is then you are bringing that background too far forwards, and it won't give the impression of the distance. So just a few light touches here and there with this brush to create the form of the buildings. And another way of compensating and getting around those mistakes I made with the pine trees. Again, just use the finger. The trees are still quite damp. This watercolor paper is retaining the moisture quite well. The atmospheric conditions where I'm painting, they're not too dry. Maybe 50% humidity, I guess. But if you're working in a really dry, hot area, then obviously it could have dried. Long before now, but it just gives you an extra opportunity to keep reworking those trees and get around any mistakes, as long as you don't overdo it. Again, it works with good quality cotton-based paper like this Saunders paper here. It is quite dark underneath the, or darker underneath these two blinds on the right. But I think I actually fancy keeping it quite light, just really understated, a few lines just to depict objects in there. Maybe I'll put in a figure as well. Keep it fairly simple. A few posts along the, or I guess these are objects to, again, I'll ask any nautical friends out there, do you know what you call these objects on the quayside where you would attach your boat to with rope or whatever? They must have a name, but they're little tiny sort of fixings or posts on that quayside. Right, with this brush I now need to create some form to these boats, and these lines do help to convey a more realistic impression of a boat, with the water line here, an outboard motor, maybe a window, a little bit of shadow under the roof of the cabin. This can be any darker colour here, so a bit of alizarin crimson, neutral tint, pick up a bit of burnt umber. It can be anything really, but it is fairly thick, not too much water at all. And I'm just picking up any paint that's in the palette, because there's a slight slope on the board on the palette. I've got a few little accumulations of moisture that I can just use for this. I don't need much water at all. I am also trying to introduce different, with this darker paint, different markings along the boats, or different colours. So it could be a reddish colour, could be a bluish colour. Doesn't really matter for these in the distance as long as it's fairly dark. And with the these darker motors, when I put in the reflections for these, those reflections in the background will just look a little bit better. Another line across the top there, excuse me, and on that right-hand boat. Just really going around with the brush and just dabbing in what you might think are random marks, but they all have some contribution to make to the painting, and I don't want to overdo it. So it comes with practice on knowing when to stop. So this brush now has a flat edge to it. Pick up a bit of water, it was too dry. Keep mixing again. Check the edge, make sure I've got a flat edge, and then a sort of wavy, zigzaggy pattern down. And then there's some darker gaps between the boats as well. Paint a few of those in. Few more. Excuse the glare again because of the angle of my light here, so I can see what I'm doing. I was painting this during the evening, and so I had to have my artificial lights on. But to get this painting well lit with the angle, it can sometimes cause a bit of a conflict with the angle of the camera. So until it dries, it will dry a little bit. Well, you won't get that glare, of course. I'm using the brush to create a few more horizontal lines in the sea, not too many. There are some benches up against the retaining wall. I'll get in a couple of those. I've done one already. A few masts. Always good to have a few vertical details for boats. They serve a good purpose in connecting the boat to a different area behind them, and just is another element, another thing on the boat that makes it look more realistic as a boat. Few more squiggly marks on the right hand side, just to, I thought it looked a bit bare over on that right hand side, so don't think there weren't too many in the source photo, but I've put them in. Back with the medium sized mop brush to create the shadow from the drivers, from the what do you call them, pilot, from the pilot's seat. And then a few shadows, thin shadows along the edge of that white boat. The motor at the back of the boat is just catching a bit of light along the top edge, but then coming down into the boat, it goes a little bit darker. A few more objects coming off of that, cables, fuel cables or fixings and so on. And then the middle white boat, little bit of highlights across the top and then go darker. It's similar, well, it's a little bit darker than the sea may be, but darker obviously than the rest of the boat. This fender I'm going to make red. It's actually blue in the photograph, but I think red would be just adding a bit more of a extra interest to it and adding a bit more of a red to the reflection, just added that on top of the reflection of the fender. I've got to include a bit of internal details to that left-hand boat, just a bit. Define a bit more of the details on this boat, a bit more. Some of the inside, this central column where the steering wheel is. I'm coming out with all these nautical terms, sounding like cars. I'm sure there's a term for it. You can tell I'm not a nautical person. And just a bit more of a shadow underneath the seats as well. So that gives them a bit more of a three-dimensional form. A steady line along, a curved line along the top of the boat. Another element which just improves the look of the boat. I could include a second one on that, I think. If you like this video and want to get automatic notifications on future releases of videos. Normally I release a new video every week or two on different subjects in watercolor. So please subscribe to my channel. Click on the subscribe button. I'd be very grateful. Just sends a message back to Google, the powers that be, that you quite like this this type of video, and you will get well, it's a way of getting notifications on future release as well. And please include, if you've got time, pop in some comments about how you might have adopted or how you might have painted those trees, where I sort of made a little bit of a mistake on, but I think they're looking a little bit better now, a bit more convincing as trees in front of the buildings. But let me know about your watercolor mistakes and how you got around them, rather than abandoning the painting. So that would be the last thing to do, which I can't actually think of ever abandoning a painting. I just keep going and realize I've made a mistake, but then try and learn something from that. Bit of a strong vertical line on that building. This painting, or this subject, has lots of horizontal areas. I think it needs a few more verticals, lampposts and things in that on that grassy bank there, and of course the tree trunks will give that a little bit. With the greener areas where it's dried lighter, and those round shapes, I could emphasize some of those and make them into something else, or make them more into a tree with bigger volume, perhaps by adding in some darker paint around the edge of it or around the side of it, just to emphasize it a bit more. Use my fingertip method again, just to smudge things. Most paintings I end up with very dirty hands, where you've got to be careful when, particularly the area below, that I don't smudge anything down there. So I put in a lamppost or a taller post on the right hand side, and then getting a reflection for that. Bit of a stronger vertical here, bring that down into the reflection in the water. I need a few more darker areas between the boats, just to define a little bit more where one boat stops and the other one starts, and then some reflections. It's just an excuse to get in some darker reflections in the water, adding in those darker marks. But I think I've got the impression of those far boats there. pull them. Things begin to pull together when you get in these bit of details around the boats, the horizontal lines, the water line particularly, and then these reflections. You might have seen there the paper is buckled a little bit because the paint is not 100%, the paper's not 100% dry yet, so it's still a little bit buckly, if that's the right expression. Now this is the second, the paper will dry flat, by the way, so I don't need to worry too much about that. So that's the second bench there behind that boat, just to create a bit of contrast from the light top of the boat to the between the bench and that lighter top. Contrast is always a good thing to have in watercolors to create a bit more of an impact and atmosphere. So for example, my middle boat in the foreground, the lighter boat with the darker reflections around it, the two blinds where the fishermen do all their repairs there, that's lighter against the darker background, the darker silhouette of the buildings against the lighter sky. They're all different areas of contrast that really do help pull together a watercolor painting. The pencil marks that are still showing on the unpainted areas, I will rub out a lot of those towards the end just to get in a bit more of a contrast. They're sort of not giving us a nice clean edge at the moment, but when I do rub them out, I will get that crisp edge in a number of areas coming back. So don't forget to have a look at patreon.com if you want to have a go at some of the painting projects I set, and also I'm able to share, well, there's a lot of exclusive posts up there that you won't see anywhere else. And on these painting projects, I'm able to share a high-res image of the end painting and also the source photo, which is not possible through YouTube. There's a lot of things I can do up on the Patreon platform that aren't possible on YouTube. So please take a look at that, patreon.com/Tim Wilmot, TIMWILMOT. Love to see you up there and take part in our monthly projects and live streams that we have, all exclusive to Patreon. Really at this stage I'm just pulling things together, and I will, after I've completed painting, I will then do a little bit of a summary on a reflection on how the painting went, which subconsciously I do on every painting is just thinking about, did it go okay, yes or no, and then what bits worked well, what bits didn't work so well. Try and remember, next time I do a subject like this, what will I try and do better, just to improve things. A bit more detail on the fenders, on that second boat. I'll add in another line. There we go. Maybe it's a bit too dark, so I can just rub out a little bit with my fingertips. Actually, the paper's quite dry now, so I can be a little bit rougher with it and not damage the paper. I do also use a tiny bit of white paint to just improve, just to highlight a few objects where it may not be possible to paint around everything. So for example, well, typically vertical lines like masts or aerials. This little white thing here, that there was a little white object which I quite fortunately had left and painted around, but there is some sort of white object sticking up from that white boat there, which I used, and maybe a few little bits of white on some of the boats, and maybe some railings or something catching the light as it's coming through the gaps. And maybe across the tops of the balconies as well. So this is me now rubbing out some of the areas just to remove those pencil lines, just to get a crisper edge. A little bit of a summary then of this painting, Chania harbour in Crete, and my take on watercolour mistakes and how to get around them. And there was, well, the couple of issues that I sort of had with this painting was the tops of those trees, trying to think that I could get them quite light. Bit of a tricky timing decision between the background buildings and then these lighter tops of those pine trees, and then the darker base of those trees. And my way around that, well, before it dried, add in a bit more thicker, slightly darker colour, but then go dark towards the base of those trees. And a little bit of splattering as well helped, like that mark there, this mark here, a little bit of splattering there as well, depending on how thick the colour was. That would depend on the sort of mark that you're left with after doing some splattering. And my other little trick or thing that I did was to provide some more detail in the object behind the building there. So these horizontal lines, for example, just creating some effect of the different levels of the building and the ground floor and these blinds and so on at the base there. Other little area I sort of left out was that whiter area there. I could have rubbed out that bit of squiggly mark there, but that whiter area there. Now, actually, the sea dried a little bit lighter, so watercolor is going to dry a bit lighter, so I can get away with it. But again, maybe just planning, trying to avoid these things. This video isn't really on how to avoid mistakes in the first place, but you've made the mistake. Don't give up. Just keep pursuing. Crack on with the painting and see what becomes of it. So don't give up. And that sort of worked out okay. And along the way, we've covered a few other watercolor techniques. Well, we've covered composition, trying to get the balance of the picture looking right. We've got foreground interest, we've got middle ground interest, we've got a bit of background as well. We're using values a lot as well. So the difference between the lighter areas and the darker areas. We have some lighter areas, so that covering to the boat there against the darker area. This boat here, light against the darker area of the sea, and again these lighter boats against the darker background, the buildings against the lighter sky behind them. So use of contrast, and then different brushes, different brush marks. So we started off with that mop brush, laying over bigger areas of paint over the paper, going over these blinds with any red or orange or some brighter color, and then painting around it with darker color just to create the form of those blinds. Dry brush marks as well in the painting. So I zoom in, dry brush marks just to create a bit more of an interesting texture. Actually, when you zoom in like this, you can begin to see the sort of marks I made for the boats. Now that there was a window. This here is the engine on the back of the boat. So, some of them were just very quick squiggles, and they sort of work out all right. And then those marks for the reflections there of the boats. And when painting boats, trying to think of the different accessories that just make it look more realistic as a boat. So if I go back or I zoom in, getting in that darker waterline, maybe a line across or just below the hull, a window or two, maybe a line underneath the cabin, that engine. Other things might be fenders, a bit of rope coming out from these boats maybe, and then you can get in a bit of reflection from that rope. So there we are. Watercolor mistakes and how to get around them. Love to hear about how you pop in the comments. How do you get around watercolor mistakes? Assuming that you don't give up on a painting, do you lift off? Do you have a magic eraser? Are you using bleach? Or maybe not. No, that should be the wrong thing. Never use bleach. But how do you get around mistakes? And what would be your process for painting trees like that? Dark trees against a fairly dark background, the light coming towards you, a bit of contre-jour. Hope you enjoyed it. Catch up with you on the next video.